Hey there hunters, welcome back to the Gunners Guild. Today I have Sarah Symmetry back with me again to discuss another monster that got changed between the generations, but unlike Glavenus where we discussed how poorly he was implemented in World, today we're actually going to highlight Rathalos and show you how much he's improved between 4th gen and 5th gen, Rise included. So thank you Sarah for joining me, and let's go ahead and talk about Rathalos.
Thanks Fem. As every hunter knows, Rathalos is the flagship monster for the entire franchise. Most hunters can tell you a lot about the King of the Skies, as it's the one thing we've constantly had to fight throughout the ages. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the fight has also changed as the game has evolved, so we're going to take a peek at these last 3 sets of Monster Hunter games, being Generations, World, and of course Rise, and we'll cover the good aspects versus the bad aspects of the fight as it's gone through those ages. Since we're also going to be comparing it to Rise as well, we're only going to be looking at the high rank versions, since let's be honest, no one wants to relive World's Master Rank fight, and triple fireballs can quite frankly suck it.
So starting with the old 4th gen version in Gen Ultimate, Rathalos was fought a lot in these older games, not just because he was in a large amount of quests because he was around all the time, but also because his gear is actually a staple for most hunters. A full set always provided great skills like attack up medium or large, or weakness exploit, and wind protection. So a lot of players are familiar with the Rathalos fight, and they're actually aware of how kind of okay the fight is. Like, it's not an amazing fight, but it's also not the worst either. Rathalos has always been a middle of the pack monster. He has some predictable patterns, such as the fireball after the enrage roar to go airborne, and the airborne fireballs which make him prime dunking material.
Exactly. There's always a sense of catharsis whenever you slap a smug flying idiot monster out of the air, and Rathalos has seen his fair share. Now this whole aspect gives players a sense of superiority of the monster, and it is honestly one of the key reasons why the Rathalos fight has always been enjoyable in some form or another.
Especially because he's usually very aggressive, leaving very little room for attacks, and getting those dunks just make you want to jump up and scream a big ol' fuck you to Rathalos. The problems with the fight arise more with the clunky aspects of older generations. He's airborne a lot in old gen, at least when he's in rage. At normal state he's actually on the ground a lot. And this wouldn't be too much of a problem if not for the wind pressure he exerts. His wind pressure was notoriously bad, and he loved to fly by hunters and just ruin their day with it. Getting airborne, coming down, everything always had wind pressure with it, which is a very minor inconvenience for sure, but it happens constantly, and that's where the frustration really begins for a lot of players. For the most part, players didn't actually want to gem in wind pressure resistance. Even if they did, most of the time it was on Rathalos' gear anyway, so you'd have to suffer for quite some time. Rathalos' airborne mode was notoriously awful. Whereas in newer generations, monsters stay relatively close to the ground when fighting. This incredibly ham-fisted attack pattern had Rathalos slowly float a couple body lengths up in the air, completely out of reach, and he could just stay up there and spam fireballs at you. But the most hated combo were the poisonous talons while airborne. That had precision sniping skills greater than a 12-year-old Call of Duty player hooked up to a Ritalin IV drip. Everybody hated this attack, and the fact that it stunned on top of poisoned you as well made it all the worse. And of course, the last horrible attack plaguing many old generation monsters was the instant charge. From an idle position, if he decided to charge, the hurt box would begin before he even takes a step, so if you were up in his face, good chances are you're just gonna eat shit and die. And lastly, he had one really bad hitbox, but not because it was a nuisance to players, but because it seemed to never do anything at all. While airborne, Rathalos could spray fire in a wide sweep, but I don't think I've ever been hit by it. Like, he does it a lot, and it's never connected. I feel Rathalos is too high to hit with it, and it just goes over players' heads every single time. It's super weird, we'll talk about it more later though.
The Generations Rathalos fight and older games has always been a bit of a mixed bag. While the fight's been enjoyable and rewarding, the little janky aspects ruin the fun for a lot of players. You wouldn't ever hear players saying that Rathalos is their favourite monster or favourite fight. That would almost be like hearing someone's favourite band were Coldplay, and I mean, come on. But let's take a step into the future and check him out in Monster Hunter World. World was more than just a fresh coat of paint for the franchise, it was a big rework, so it stands to say that Rathalos would also get a big facelift.
As we know, World played a lot on the environments and life in them, which I feel was one of the biggest and best features of the game actually. Rathalos in particular got a ton of little details that made him feel much more like an actual living creature in the ecosystem. Things like sleeping in his nest, actually hunting small monsters for food, scratching his claws on trees, and of course turf wars with other monsters. While these features don't impact his fight at all, you couple these with the lofty perch he spawns in for the Ancient Forest map, and they do paint a picture of Rathalos being the king of his domain, and it just gives him much more character than before. In the same vein, not directly impacting his fight, the Rathalos armor was also great and frequently used in sets for hunters, making Rathalos a monster that we will have more than a few run-ins with. So players had more time to experience it. So let's talk about the fight itself. World Rathalos is actually a big step up over GU's Rathalos. Not always for the best reasons though. Difficulty-wise, it was definitely toned down from previous iterations. This was mostly due to the change in the dunking for World. Dunking was the player term given to knocking out a monster out of the sky with damage on a specific stagger point, usually the head though.
That's right. You see, whereas in older games monsters would dunk and be on the floor for just a few seconds like 3, World dunks for certain unfortunate monsters would last 8 seconds. Go ahead, count that out. 8 whole seconds is a lot of time for a monster to not be moving, especially when it's easily repeatable and easily accessible as his head was much closer to the ground whilst he was in the air. Melee weapons excelled at this, and thus, Rathalos was the target of many speedruns to exploit this aspect of the fight.
Now on top of the head dunk, Rathalos did get an easier leg topple as well, allowing you to chain dunks, KOs, and leg topples, which allow you to chain locks and effectively prevent the monster from moving for most of the fight. Take that as a positive or negative, but it did make the fight much easier than it needed to be in the right hands. Rathalos still had a good set of patterns though, with his enraged fireball, baitable fireballs, and roars, and these did make him feel like a more active and engaging fight overall. His hitboxes were also improved upon a lot, allowing the player to hide in spots like the neck or legs during a bite or tail spin, which did help solidify the sense that he was a particularly easy monster to deal with, but also made the fight much less tedious in the process. His notorious attacks, such as the heat-seeking claws of death and the instant charges, were also toned down considerably. The claws were preceded by a very telling screech, and paired with the overall slower movement, makes them much easier to avoid.
Referring back to the instant charge problem, and the one that came with most monsters, it's still a little bit of an issue, but they aren't spanned anywhere near as much as older generations, beside maybe Rathians. Rathalos charges have a slight head lift before he starts the hurt box, and if you're behind him, he'll turn to face you. And it's still insanely difficult to get away if you're right up close to him, but they really aren't used as often. It's definitely not as annoying. So, whilst the world version of Rathalos did get a lot of work done to it, the player's extra mobility, tools, and power creep outshined his fight entirely. The end result was that Rathalos was most people's target dummy in test monsters for learning new weapons. Now, this brings us on to Kamura Village and the current iteration of Rathalos in Rise.
So Rise is Rathalos. In my opinion, this is the best he's ever been, and he's one of my favorite fights of all in Rise. This fight was reworked almost entirely, taking new moves from his other forms and getting entirely new ones, making this fight basically rebuilt from the ground up. Rathalos is now much more aggressive in Rise, and even though he is only a high rank monster, he feels like we're fighting a G rank monster at times. With his new aggressive moveset, Rathalos no longer has the issue of being airborne for far too long, which is good because monsters have flash resistance in Rise like Iceborne, so after 2 dunks of flashes, he just air staggers. His new moveset alternates between land and air constantly. Typically every 2 attacks he switches up his land and air game. This mix-up feels extremely fresh as the fight has a lot of verticality to it, but also gives melee player actual opportunities to keep pressure on Rathalos. It's an extremely hectic fight at times, just due to the insane amount of speed Rathalos has. Which is good because players have some insane power creep in Rise as well, so it's nice to see a monster get an equal treatment and be able to keep up with that power creep. That was the main problem with World's Rathalos, it just didn't feel threatening, as the players had way too many tools and too much power to use against it. Yes, the power in Rise is crazy, but Rathalos' fight in Rise can go from you being in control to being 6 feet under really fast. However, this was sometimes attributed to jank. Rise Rathalos has 2 main flaws that I can see. The first is that his new fireball attack that he does after his flyby has an infinite angle of lock-on. So you can roll past his flyby and then get behind Rathalos' head and the fireball will still come straight through his body and get you. There is no escape from that fireball, besides a well-timed dodge of course. So even if the fight seems under control, that janky fireball could get you and it hurts, and then the fight would just spiral downwards as you have to heal or roll off the flames, and Rathalos was just left to rampage.
One of the other ways that you would lose control of the fight in Rise is due to the poor AI. You see, large monsters like to engage small monsters in Rise and vice versa. Older games had most small monsters like the drones or the jaggies flee to the corner of the map when large monsters enter the area, but not Rise. So now, randomly, Rathalos will just bugger off the zone to attack a Arachnoid or a Vespoid that said something bad about its mum, and you're playing catch up to keep your momentum going. Rathalos would go for this small monster, and whilst he's attacking them, this stray charge, a tail swipe, or even a fireball that wasn't aiming for the player will get them hit as they tried to get back into the swing of things. I personally have lost count of the amount of times I've dropped into the lava cavern to see Rathalos already mid-aggro because of some minor dispute with the spider. It gets ridiculous after a while, and one of the main reasons why speedrunning in Rise can be so tempestuous.
Those are the only real downsides to the Rathalos fight in Rise though. His notorious attacks like the claws and charge are a non-issue now. In fact, I don't think the Rathalos charges anymore unless he's actually coming down from the air, or not enraged. It's very rare. Oh, his fire sweep too, that never hit you in older games, that attack actually hits players now. It's crazy, right? It actually does damage. It's actually very effective too, and he uses it on the turf war for Anjanath and stuff. So, I mean, great, they're using it. It does damage. He's low enough that it hits. Overall, it's a big step up for Rathalos. I'm eager to see him in Mastering form in Sunbreak, because he's just gonna be crazy. Especially if we get like Azure or Silverlos. This is my favorite reintroduction to a monster we were so familiar with in fighting all these years. It caught myself and a lot of players off guard seeing this old punching bag finally punch back, and boy does he. But that's all for us. Thank you again, Sarah. I appreciate all your help and work. Make sure you guys go check out Sarah's channel, as his voice is much sexier than mine, and he provides more intelligent and thought out content, something that is severely on the decline these days.
Fem's right, you should go check out my channel. I'm a sneeze away from 5k and you know what to do.
But yeah, thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters.